Okay, so we have all of our information. Now we want to start graphing. The horizontal shift tells us where to start, and the intervals tell us what is our distance between. Now when we graph this, make it as easy on yourself as possible. So that's why I tell you to find this information. So I know I'm going to start at 0, and then I'm going to go up by pi fourths. Remember I said that it's 5 points for 1 period, 9 points for 2 periods. So I'm just going to make 5 somewhat evenly spaced tick marks. Okay, so it's not perfect, but hopefully you get the idea. Now the intervals were pi fourths. So starting at 0, I'm going to count by pi fourths. So this is going to be pi fourths. Then I have 2 pi fourths, so that's pi halves, 3 pi fourths, and 4 pi fourths, which is pi. Now from here, which was 0, to pi, that should be my period, which it is. The amplitude was 3. So again, I'm going to label this 3, and then down here, I'm going to label this -3. Now this was a sine curve, so remember I showed you what the basic sine pattern looks like. So I'm going to have 5 points. It starts on the axis. It starts at your horizontal and vertical shift, the intersection of those. Then it's going to go up, then it's back on the axis, then down, then back on the axis. So that is 1 period. Now we want to do 2 periods, so I need to add 4 more tick marks because this is the first point of the next period. So pi, so I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, try to make them evenly spaced. It's not perfect. This was 4 pi fourths, so then 5 pi fourths, 6 pi fourths is 3 pi halves, 7 pi fourths, 8 pi fourths is 2 pi. Just continue on with the pattern because it's cyclic. So that is 2 periods of the sine curve. Again, make things as easy on yourself as possible. You'll notice that almost every graph I do that's a sine curve is going to look pretty much exactly like that. It's just the numbers that are going to change because I want to give my I want to make my spacing nice so it's easy for me to graph. Okay, now let's do a cosine. So again, let's go through the things that we want to find. Well, vertical shift is 0 here because we're not adding anything onto the end. What is our amplitude? Our amplitude is 3. Remember, this is a -3, so the negative will affect the graph, but the amplitude is 3. Our period is 2 pi divided by b, but b is 1, so our period is 2 pi. Our horizontal shift, in this case, is going to be pi fourths, so I'm shifting pi fourths to the right. I get that by if I do x minus pi fourths equals 0, and I solve for x, I get x equals pi fourths. The intervals are the period divided by 4. So if I do 2 pi divided by 4, that's pi halves. Okay, so I've got everything I need. So I draw my axis again. I know it's based on the x-axis since there was no vertical shift. And now I'm going to start at pi fourths. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is going to be 3. This is going to be -3. Now I'm going to actually label these. So again, this is pi fourths. And now the intervals are pi halves, so I'm adding pi halves each time. So pi fourths plus pi halves is going to be 3 pi fourths, 5 pi fourths, 7 pi fourths, and 9 pi fourths. So those are all the points for 1 period of this function. Notice that the distance between pi fourths and 9 pi fourths is 2 pi, which is the period. Now in this case I'm just going to continue on. So and then we'll go 11 pi fourths, 13 pi fourths, 15 pi fourths, and 17 pi fourths. Okay, now I want to actually graph the points. So this was cosine. It was negative though, because remember there was a negative 3 in front, so the amplitude is 3, but because it's negative it's going to flip the graph, so it's going to start below the axis. If it was a positive cosine graph, it would start up here. And then I just follow the cosine pattern. So that would be 1 period. I follow the pattern again, and that would be 2 periods. Now I'm just going to connect the dots. So there are 2 periods of my cosine curve. Okay, so now I want you to try one that has everything in it. So we haven't done one with a vertical shift yet, but it's going to be exactly the same. Everything is just based on the vertical shift. So go ahead and try to graph 2 periods of this function. Pause the video and unpause it when you're ready to check your work. Okay, so hopefully your graph looks like this. More importantly, hopefully you have the labeling and the numbers correctly. So let's look at how I got that. Well, the vertical shift is 3 because of the plus 3 there. The amplitude is 2. The period is 2 pi over pi, which is 2. The horizontal shift is 1/2, and you can see that from my work up here. Pi x minus pi halves equals 0, so x equals 1/2. The intervals are the period divided by 4, so that's 1/2. So the first thing I did was, when I drew the axes, I noticed that there was a vertical shift of up 3, and that the amplitude was 2, so I know that the entire graph is going to take place above the x-axis. So I drew the x-axis at the very bottom. Now I drew in my new axis of 3, and then I labeled the 1 and the 5, because from 3 I'm going to go up 2, and I'm going to go down 2 because of the amplitude. The horizontal shift was 1/2, so I know my first tick mark is at 1/2. The intervals were also 1/2, so I know I'm going to add 1/2 each time. So that's how I got all of my points. It's a sine curve, so it starts on the axis. It was positive, so it goes up next, then back on the axis, then down, then back on the axis. And then I just continue that around for the second period. Alright, last thing we're going to look at is working backwards, finding a sine and cosine equation from a graph. Now here there are an infinite amount of answers. Some are going to be a little bit easier than others, but if you have this curve, I want you to try to write a sine equation for it and a cosine equation. Anytime you can write a sine equation, you can always write a cosine equation because you know they're the same function but shifted pi halves from each other. Go about this in the same way you did if you were to graph the function. So first try to figure out what's the vertical shift, what is the amplitude, what is the period, and so on, and then just write that into an equation. So pause the video and try to come up with a sine equation and a cosine equation. If you get stuck or when you want to check your answers, unpause. Okay, so I wrote a couple of answers down here. For sine, one correct answer would be y equals 2 plus 3 sine of x minus pi halves, or y equals 2 minus 3 of sine of x plus pi halves. For cosine, one correct answer would be y equals 2 minus 3 cosine of x. Another correct answer would be y equals 2 plus 3 cosine of x minus pi. Now, let's look at how I came up with that if you're confused. So first I recognized that the vertical shift was 2, and so I drew in that line so it's easy for me to see that that is the middle of the graph vertically. Next I can see the amplitude is 3. So from the vertical shift I go up 3 and I go down 3. So therefore I know the amplitude is 3. The period I know is 2 pi. Now I have to find that by finding 2 consecutive points in a cycle. So for instance I looked at this point here and this point here. That is, I could say the start and the end of a cycle, and that's 2 pi apart. You could also look up here, or at this point and this point, but basically you're looking for one complete cycle and the distance between those points, and so I can see that it's 2 pi. Now horizontal shift, you choose the horizontal shift. So for instance for sine, any of these points on this vertical shift axis could be my horizontal shift. So pi halves, negative pi halves, 3 pi halves, negative 3 pi halves. There are other choices, but the graph is cut off in this case. And then same with cosine. So for cosine, it has to start at a peak or at a valley. So it could be 0, pi, 2 pi, negative pi, and negative 2 pi. So now once I pick those, then I come up with my equation for sine or cosine. Okay, so we want to remember how to find the amplitude, how to find the period, the vertical shift, the horizontal shift, and our graphing strategies for sine and cosine.